The early morning light was icy gray over the city, as if nature itself were holding its breath. The royal palace, majestic and silent, towered over the square like a fortress from another world. Here, among the high walls and cobblestone streets, was Private James Adiola, a royal guard whose appearance in his black and red uniform with its perfectly polished brass buckle was awe-inspiring. But this morning brought with it a strange sense of unease. James felt each step as if he were marching not on stones, but on thin ice. His black skin contrasted with his snow-white gloves, and he knew that the many eyes fixed on him were not without judgment. But he didn't let those thoughts cloud his mind. His purpose was simple and clear: to do his duty to the crown, to himself, to history. The air was still, and even the wind seemed too tense to ruffle the flag over the palace. James glanced around the square where it was usually quiet at this time of day. But today the silence seemed foreign, almost treacherous. Far in the corner, he spotted the first group of tourists, pulling out their phones, preparing for another picture with the unwavering guardsman. He knew that to them he was more than human. He was part of a living spectacle. Scraps of thoughts ran through James's mind. You are the face of the service, the symbol of discipline and honor. You must not waver, must not give away a shadow of doubt. It was something he'd learned over the years, and self-control was his weapon of choice. But the feeling of something amiss didn't go away. It was as if someone invisible was watching him with ill intentions. His gaze instinctively slid farther away to where a roaring motorcycle flashed by. The black machine roared aggressively into the square, disturbing its peaceful atmosphere. The driver, hidden beneath his helmet, moved slowly as if to draw attention to himself. James was wary. This was unusual. Usually, vehicles passed quickly, not lingering in the protected area. But this one slowed down. Too slow. The crowd began to glance around. Tension hung in the air. James squinted his eyes, assessing the situation. He didn't know yet that this particular motorcyclist would soon turn his morning into the longest of his life. The roar of the engine echoed among the stone walls like the thunderclap before a storm. The black motorcycle glided across the square like a predator, and its driver slowed down, allowing the crowd to see himself. Whispers began to whisper around, and the eyes of the tourists darted between the guard and the motorcyclist. But the driver himself seemed to be looking only at James. Through the dark glass of his helmet, he could feel the contempt, subtle but burning. The driver jerked the throttle sharply, causing a shrill engine howl that echoed in the ears of those standing nearby. James didn't move. His face remained as impassive as a mask, but inwardly he felt this sharp sonic assault strike his patience. The guardsman stood straight, hands clenched tightly on the hilt of his rifle. Every muscle in his body tensed like a string. The motorcyclist slowed even more, almost stopping right in front of James. He removed his helmet, exposing his face, white-skinned with a crooked grin that had nothing good-natured about it. "Hey, you!" His voice was rough and harsh, deliberately loud so everyone around him could hear. "How do you stand there, huh? Like a monkey in a cage? I hope they pay you well for it, bro." James didn't flinch. His face remained as still as ever, but those words cut through him like a knife. He knew he had no right to answer, that any movement or reaction would be considered a violation. Yet every cell in his body screamed in response to this humiliation. The motorcyclist, seeing that his words elicited no reaction, began to move in circles like a shark around its prey. "What? Have you swallowed your tongue? Or did your crown tell you to keep quiet? It's funny, of course, seeing how they put you here. A black hide and a red uniform. That's their joke, isn't it? The crowd around them began to change. Some turned away in horror. Others took out their phones to film what was happening. But no one dared to intervene. People didn't know what to do. The situation was developing quickly, but its tension was almost palpable. The tourist serenity of the square collapsed in the blink of an eye. James stood there, his eyes staring ahead, as if the motorcyclist's words didn't reach him. But inside him was rage, mixed with despair. Not because he couldn't answer, but because there were too many like this man. He knew that this attack wasn't directed at him personally. It was part of something bigger, older, uglier. The driver froze, stopping the motorcycle right in front of the guardsman. "Hey, I'm talking to you. Can you even hear me?" He spat on the ground in front of James, but his gesture read a threat to do more. The crowd began to buzz. People were nervous, as if they were facing an impending storm. James felt everything in him screaming for action, but he remained still. The only thing he could control now was his dignity. "Okay, you keep quiet and I'll be back." The motorcyclist smirked, putting on his helmet and riding away with a deafening roar. His words hung in the air like smoke. "See you soon, hero." James stared after him, sensing that this was only the first wave. The real storm was yet to come. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from and whether something similar has happened to you in your life. We're interested to hear how you reacted in these situations and what helped you cope. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation and other interesting stories. And now we continue. The square was getting crowded. More and more tourists were arriving by the minute, their voices merging into a single hum, interspersed with camera flashes. For most, it was just another carefree day, taking pictures, looking at the guardsmen, immersing themselves in the royal atmosphere. But the tension in the air was beginning to break through their serenity. James stood as still as a statue, but he could feel every look, every whispered discussion. People couldn't take their eyes off the motorcyclist who had returned. He, like an ominous shadow, circled the square slowly, as if looking for a victim. It seemed clear to everyone. He was targeting the guardsman again. The crowd began to disperse to the sides, leaving an empty space between James and the motorcyclist. This gap seemed to emphasize the separation. The lone, black guard standing behind his post, and the white aggressor who seemed to be enjoying his power at this moment. "Look at him," came the loud, mocking voice of the motorcyclist. He spoke deliberately so that everyone could hear him. Standing there like a mannequin, thinking he's important, but inside, just dirt, just covered up by a nice uniform. A few people gasped, some averted their eyes, but most stayed where they were, silent as unwilling witnesses. Someone was already holding a phone at the ready, filming what was happening, but no one intervened. People are often afraid to be the first to confront evil. The motorcyclist stopped his car a few meters away from James and, taking off his helmet, put it on the handlebars. "Hey, kid, how about you want to entertain the crowd a little? How about a dance? You like dancing, don't you?" He let out a gruff laugh, overlapping the whispers of the crowd. James stood like a stumbling man. His posture remained straight, but there was something in his eyes that only someone who knew humiliation could recognize. He could not respond. The system he represented demanded absolute equanimity from him, but every insulting glance, every taunt struck at his dignity as a human being, forcing him to struggle against the anger growing inside. The motorcyclist took a step forward. "What? You're not going to talk? Maybe you need some help? Oh, I know you're waiting for an order. Well, here it is. Sit down. Sit on the ground. That's what you're here for." His voice sounded like a lash. The crowd was silent. People were confused, but no one made a move to stop him. Only a child in a red jacket tugged his mother's arm and asked, "Mommy, why is that uncle yelling?" But she hurriedly took her son aside without saying a word. James held the motorcyclist's gaze again, but his lips trembled slightly. It was almost imperceptible, but enough for those watching closely. The aggressor smirked when he saw it. "Aha! You're not ironclad, are you? That's what I was thinking. It's all for show. And on the inside you're a weakling, just like the rest of you." The words echoed in James's ears. He could have taken it all, but that "you" reminded him of what this man represented. This wasn't a personal attack. It was an attack on his skin color, on his background, on everything he was proud of. The crowd stood frozen. People felt they were part of something painful, something they could not fully understand. But none of them moved to put an end to it. They just watched as James, gritting his teeth, remained motionless, despite the waves of humiliation that came one after another. At this moment, it seemed as if the sky above the square had become even grayer, as if time itself had stopped, forcing everyone to face the harsh, merciless reality. The square was drowning in tension, as if the air had become thick, viscous, barely passable. The whole crowd stood breathless, staring at the motorcyclist and the lone guard. No one dared to move or say a word. Only the phone cameras, aimed at what was happening, flickered in the morning light, like silent witnesses to what was about to happen. The motorcyclist took off his gloves and threw them to the ground, as if foreshadowing something. He stepped closer to James, now almost close, with a smirk that cut like a knife. His voice sounded drawn out with a hint of mockery. "What, hero? You still think you're better than us? Standing here in your toy uniform and hoping someone respects you?" He looked back at the crowd, spreading his arms wide. "How many of you respect him? Who even thinks this guy deserves to stand here?" The hum of the crowd grew louder and louder. Some whispered, some turned away, but most continued to stare. James remained silent, as was required of him. His face remained impassive, but inside everything was burning. Anger, shame, humiliation, all mixed into a firestorm. "Oh, you're still quiet," the motorcyclist continued, squinting his eyes. "You know, it's in your blood. Used to being obedient. Used to having things decided for you that you don't mean anything. Isn't that right?" He paused, his voice now dripping with venom. "You're just a pretty accessory, like a stuffed animal in a shop window. But even a stuffed animal can say thank you. How about you?" The crowd froze. James didn't flinch, though his heart was pounding so loudly he thought he could be heard. His pride and self-control fought the urge to respond. "Hey!" The motorcyclist raised his voice, blocking out the rumble around him. "I'm talking to you. Or have you gotten used to keeping quiet when those more important than you speak?" He took another step forward. Now he stood so close that there were only a few centimeters between them. The crowd held its breath, and at that moment, like a beast ready to deliver the final blow, the motorcyclist spat sharply in James's face. The crowd gasped. The sound, short, piercing, echoed. For a second, everything froze. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the wind died down. James closed his eyes, feeling a drop of saliva trickle down his cheek. His hands clenched on the grip of the gun, his fingers tense, like the bowstring ready to snap. That's it. That's where you should be. Wet-faced, silent. Someone like you doesn't even deserve this post," the motorcyclist said, his voice hoarse with a victorious tone. But his victory didn't last long. One of the women in the crowd shouted, "What are you doing? This is crazy." Her voice broke through the silence, causing the crowd to stir. The other man, holding the phone, said, "I'm recording. It's all being recorded. You're done, kid." The motorcyclist looked away, looking a little less confident for the first time, but his gaze quickly settled back on James. "Well, are you going to do something, or are you just standing there because you were told to?" James opened his eyes. His gaze was icy, unmoving, but there was such power in it that the motorcyclist froze. The crowd fell silent too, all looking only at James. His arms relaxed, and he calmly, without a word, stretched into the familiar guard stance. His silence, his steadfastness, was louder than any words. The crowd began to applaud, quietly at first, then louder and louder. But the motorcyclist was no longer enjoying the attention. He looked confused, turning around at the people who were now judging his actions. "You're just a coward," he threw, pulling on his helmet and hastily starting the bike. But his words no longer had any force. The crowd stared at him with judgmental eyes, but James, standing at his post, remained a symbol of steadfastness and unwavering dignity, despite the humiliation he had endured. But inside, deep inside, he felt that this fight was not over. It was just beginning. The wind finally ruffled the flag over the palace, as if trying to break the silence that hung over the square. The crowd was noisy, but it all sounded to James like an echo from far away. The spitting, the humiliation, the hatred, it all mixed inside him into a rattling cocktail of emotions. But his face remained still, his gaze as sharp and hard as a blade. Every cell in his body screamed for action, but his duty was above personal grudges. The motorcyclist stopped at the edge of the square without moving away. His back arched forward, like a beast ready to jump. He took off his helmet, tossed it on the handlebars, and turned to James again. "Are you iron?" he shouted, raising his hands as if to summon the crowd for support. "This guy isn't a man. He's just a machine. Why is he silent?" I spat at him. "You all saw it. So what? You didn't even lower your eyes. Say something, you fucking bastard." His voice tore through the air, and the crowd froze, watching the scene as if it were a tragic spectacle. James didn't blink, didn't move. His gaze remained cold and focused. But in the shadow of those eyes, everything he'd kept inside him for years was simmering. The pain, the humiliation, the hatred he'd used to suppress to keep it from destroying his life. "Oh, you're just a coward," the motorcyclist continued, not getting the reaction he wanted. He stepped closer, his face becoming angry, his voice roaring to hysterics. "You're afraid of me. Afraid to say a word because you know you're nobody. Nobody. Do you understand?" "Enough," came a sudden voice from the crowd. A woman standing in the front row clenched her hands into fists. "You're being disgusting. Get out of here." "Shut up," the motorcyclist shouted, turning to her. His voice was full of rage, but there was a note of confusion in it. People in the crowd began to whisper louder. "I said leave," the woman repeated, her voice no longer shaking. But James didn't allow himself to be distracted. He stared directly into the motorcyclist's eyes, as if studying him, reading every emotion, every impulse. His face remained unruffled, but there was a power in that stillness that was beginning to weigh on the aggressor. "You think you're better than me," the motorcyclist shouted, but there was a note of fear in his voice. He could feel James's silence growing louder than his own scream. "Say something. Answer me." James lifted his head slightly, a barely perceptible movement, but it was enough. His eyes lit up with a cold flame that pierced through the motorcyclist. There was more than words in that look. It was the look of a man who had endured humiliation, hatred, and pain, but remained standing. "You won't get anywhere," James finally said, his voice quiet but so firm that everyone fell silent. His words struck like a hammer into the heart of the aggressor. The motorcyclist recoiled as if those words had repulsed him. He opened his mouth to say something but couldn't. The crowd froze, waiting for him to continue, but James was already standing again, as still as a granite monument that could not be crushed. The motorcyclist found no answer. His gaze darted between the guardsman and the crowd, where cries of condemnation began to be heard. "Get out of here!" shouted someone. "Leave him alone!" The crowd, silent until recently, now began to rise to James's defense. The motorcyclist realized that his act had failed. He abruptly put on his helmet, started the motorcycle, and sped away, leaving behind only the noise of the engine and the bitter taste in the air. But the silence that remained in the square spoke louder than any sound. James stood, his face once again a mask of equanimity, but inside he knew he had won. Not only had he withstood the attacks, but he had shown everyone that strength was not in retaliatory aggression, but in the ability to remain human when they tried to break you. And at that moment, the crowd suddenly applauded. It wasn't just a gesture of respect, it was recognition. Recognition of his strength, his dignity, his humanity. When the motorcyclist took off, his engine roared as if it had torn the air in half. That sound was the last straw in a cup of tension that had been overflowing for too long. People in the crowd began to look around, their faces a mixture of shock, anger, and incomprehension. Someone shouted something at the departing aggressor, but his words were drowned out in the growing noise. "This is crazy," exclaimed a young woman standing with a cell phone in her hands. "Did you see what he did? He was spitting, insulting. Someone should call the police." "The police? They won't do anything," the man beside her replied grimly, clenching his fists. "That bastard will just drive away, that's all. Someone should have intervened sooner." The crowd began to move like the sea before a storm. People were arguing, blaming each other, some condemning the motorcyclist, others condemning themselves for inaction. But in all the noise, the loudest was James's silence. His stillness, his impassive face, was the anchor that kept the chaos at bay. "Why didn't he do anything?" came someone's voice from deep within the crowd. A woman in a brightly colored jacket looked at James in surprise. "Why did he just stand there? He could have at least said something." "He's not allowed," the other man replied sharply. "Don't you understand? This is a royal guard. They can't answer back. It's their duty." "Duty?" someone else shouted out, and the voice sounded like a mixture of anger and pain. "This isn't duty, it's torture. To stand and endure such humiliation. How can a person be required to keep quiet when they are being insulted like this?" "This is racism, pure racism," screamed the woman with the child. Her face blazed with indignation. "He only did it because he's black. If it had been someone else in his place, this wouldn't have happened." The woman's words were like a spark in a dry forest. The crowd stirred even more. People began to shout their thoughts out loud, and the anger that had long been stored up in some of them flared up like a flame. "How long is this going to go on?" shouted a man with a cell phone. "Why do these things still happen in our world?" "He must have done something," insisted a woman in the front row. Her voice shook, and she pointed a finger at James. "You could have at least tried, and you just stood there. That doesn't change anything." But her words were immediately drowned in a flood of indignation from the others. "He's done more than you," shouted a young boy in a sports jacket. "He didn't give in. You don't even realize how much strength you have to withstand that." James heard everything, every rebuke, every praise, every question. But he remained standing, his face a mask of steel. It was important for him to hold his ground, but a storm was raging inside him. He felt he was becoming a symbol, but not willingly. "It's not just humiliation," shouted someone. "This is about all of us. We let it happen, and then we look away." In the midst of these words, a voice suddenly came over the noise. "Who recorded? Do we have a recording?" Everyone turned around, and several people raised their phones. "Yes, I wrote it all down," shouted the teenager with glittering eyes. "I'm going to post it right now. Let the world see what's going on here." "Do you think it will make any difference?" the man in the hat asked grimly. "The world has seen this sort of thing thousands of times. It's all happening over and over again." "But not this time," shouted the woman. "If we don't spread the word, nothing will change. This man must answer for his actions." Meanwhile, police officers, attracted by the noise, began to approach the crowd. People parted, pointing in the direction the motorcyclist had gone. "He went that way." "You have to catch him," they shouted. But the police officers took their time, as if this was a routine incident. "Did you see them move?" someone asked sarcastically. "In a couple more hours, they might find him." The crowd began to disperse, but the tension remained in the air like a trail of lightning. People couldn't calm down, and the chatter continued. Some stood looking at James, as if expecting some sign, word, or reaction from him. But he continued to stand, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the distance. Though the storm seemed to have subsided, everyone knew that its echoes would resound for a long time to come. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from, and whether something similar has happened to you in your life. Share your thoughts and experiences. We value your opinion. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this story and other interesting stories. And now we continue. James stood at his post as a royal guard should, motionless, with a straight back, with a cold gaze fixed on one point. At first glance, his face remained a mask, impossible to crack, but inside a hurricane was raging. Every muscle in his body felt the struggle, not with the motorcyclist, not with the crowd, but with himself. His mind was whirling like a storm, trying to find answers to questions he'd asked himself more than once. Why am I here? Why am I standing here among these walls that should symbolize greatness and justice, but instead only emphasize someone else's power? Why am I silent when every word spoken by this man hits not only me, but my history, my heritage? The thoughts cut through my consciousness like sharp shards of glass. He couldn't move. His hands gripped the handle of the gun tightly. Those white gloves, so spotlessly clean, seemed to mock how dirty this situation was. The spit, the humiliation, the anger, everything still felt like a burning mark on his skin. They wanted me to be a symbol here. But what kind of symbol am I becoming now? A man who endures, who is silent. They see strength, but there's a question burning inside me. Is this the real strength? He remembered the face of the motorcyclist. It wasn't just the face of a man. It was the embodiment of many things James had encountered his whole life. From the first day of school, when they called him not by his name, but by the color of his skin. From the first day of service, when the whispers in the locker room were a little louder than usual. They want me to break. They want me to explode, to let my anger prove them right. But I can't give them that. My anger is my curse and my strength. The crowd was still nearby. The sounds of it reached him, but it was as if from far away. Someone was talking. Someone was arguing. Someone was trying to defend him, but it only intensified the tearing internal conflict. What do they see? Do they see me as a person, or as an image, as part of this building, as a living set? Their words about justice are loud, but what will they do tomorrow when this story is just a memory? He heard a woman's voice in the crowd. Why is he just standing there? Why isn't he doing anything? Those words were like a blow to the chest. She doesn't understand. They don't understand. They only see what's on the surface. I have no right to speak, but what she doesn't know is that I would like to scream, to shout for this person to hear, for everyone to hear. Deep inside, James felt again the pain he had tried to hide. He remembered his mother's voice telling him as a child, "You have to be strong, James. You have to hold your head up higher than they do. They will always try to belittle you, but you have to remember who you are." Those words were a comfort, but today they seemed like a heavy burden. How can I remember who I am if they try to remind me every day who I'm not? He closed his eyes for a split second, feeling the heaviness of the uniform, the gun, the heaviness of the air itself. He thought of those looking at him now. All they see is the mask, but doesn't he himself turn into it? A king's guard, a symbol of fortitude and discipline. But what if it's just a shell he wears to hide the cracks inside? They want me to be strong, but how long can I stand it? And suddenly, a quiet but determined voice sounded inside him that was stronger than all doubts. You're not here for them. You're not here for that motorcyclist. You're here for yourself. You stand for those who can't. You're silent, but your silence is louder than their screams. That realization gave him back control. His breathing became even. His hands no longer trembled. He knew that his silence was a choice, and that choice was his answer. The crowd began to disperse, the noise subsided, but his inner storm didn't subside. They think it's over, but for me, this is just the beginning. I'll be standing here tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and a year from now. And every time someone challenges me, I will respond the same way. Not because I can't speak up, but because I choose not to give them power over me. James opened his eyes. His gaze was hard, his posture impeccable. He sensed that the crowd, even those who remained, now saw more than just a guardsman. They see a man who has conquered the storm within him. And in that victory, he had found new strength. The motorcyclist raced through the city streets, trying to shake off the feeling of his own failure. His anger boiled inside him like a volcano ready to explode. He felt something had gone wrong, but refused to admit it. The crowd didn't side with him, and the guardsman didn't break. The man didn't even look at him with contempt, as the motorcyclist wanted him to. Instead, his silence, his steely gaze, seemed to have drained all the strength out of him. But there was still rage inside him, mixed with growing fear. He realized that this silence was not a weakness, but a judgment. At an intersection, he stopped abruptly to catch his breath. The traffic light was red, but the street seemed empty. His hands trembled on the handlebars of his motorcycle, but he tried to suppress that weakness by gritting his teeth. "He's not human. That's impossible. He's just a costume stand," he whispered to himself, as if trying to justify himself to his own reflection in the helmet mirror. An uneasiness was growing in his chest, however. It seemed to him that someone was watching him, even here, far away from that square. He turned over his shoulder, but the street remained empty. Suddenly, he heard the sound of sirens. It was like a clap of thunder on a clear day. His heart beat faster. "Shit, the police," he muttered, hurriedly putting on his helmet and preparing to break away. But before he could even move, he saw a patrol car with blinkers blocking the road ahead. 2 officers got out of the car, their silhouettes clearly visible in the bright headlights. One of them spoke over the loudspeaker, his voice sounding cold and commanding. "Remove your helmet and get off the vehicle. Immediately." The motorcyclist hesitated. He felt his body go rigid. He wanted to turn around and ride away, but something inside him broke. He realized that now he was not a predator, but prey. He slowly removed his helmet, and the air around him seemed to fill with even more heaviness. One of the officers stepped closer, keeping his hand on his belt. "Do you know why we stopped you?" he asked, his voice taut as a string. "No," the motorcyclist lied, trying to maintain a semblance of confidence. "We have received several complaints. Your actions in the square have been recorded and relayed to us. As far as I understand, you staged a provocation and assaulted a member of the Royal Guard. Is that correct?" "I did nothing of the sort," he answered sharply, but his voice trembled. "Lying won't help here," another officer said, pulling out a clipboard with a recording of the incident. "We have the video. You're clearly visible. The spitting, the insults, the provocation. This is assault, and you will answer for it." The officer's words sounded like a hammer blow. The motorcyclist looked around. The street still seemed empty, but he knew that on the other side of this city, a crowd was already discussing his actions, condemning him. The internet would not forget. The videos went viral instantly. He thought he could hear them laughing at him, discussing his cowardice, his anger, his defeat before silence. "It was just a show," he muttered, lowering his head. "I didn't want anything." "A show? You call an assault a show?" came a voice from the patrol car. It was a young guy, apparently a random witness whom the police had invited to testify. "You don't even realize how disgusting this is. Everything you've done only shows your weakness." The motorcyclist felt his face burning with shame. He wanted to shout something back, but his tongue refused to obey. His body seemed heavier, as if he was being pressed down by a huge invisible hand. "Why did I even do that?" flashed through his mind. But there was no answer. The police, having completed the procedure, handcuffed him. As the metal closed around his wrists, he felt not only a physical shackle, but an invisible chain pulling him down. The crowd, the internet, society, everything was now against him. He had laid the groundwork for his own disaster. At this time, in the square, James was still standing guard. He knew nothing about what had happened to the motorcyclist, but somewhere in the back of his mind he felt that his silence was louder than all the words spoken that day. And that silence was the first link in a chain that would probably change everything. After the sirens died down and the street emptied, the real storm began. The incident in the square spread all over the internet like a fire. The video, shot by random witnesses, went viral. The motorcyclist, the embodiment of anger and aggression, shouting and spitting in the face of the guard, and James, motionless as a statue, who was silent but looked with such dignity that words were not needed. The comments came like hail. Everyone wanted to speak. to condemn, to justify, or simply to be part of the discussion. James, still at his post, was unaware of the whirlwind that had unfolded outside the royal square. When his shift ended, he stepped outside his usual role, but the attention that came over him was like a wave knocking him off his feet. "You're a hero!" shouted the woman, running up to him as he headed for the exit. Her eyes burned with admiration. "I saw the video. The way you stood, it was incredible. You showed the world what it means to be strong." James didn't know what to say. He only nodded politely and continued on his way, but the woman wouldn't budge. "You need to tell your story. You have inspired so many. This man, this scoundrel, he got what he deserved. And you became a symbol. A symbol. The word haunted him all the way home. Symbol of what? Fortitude? Patience? Or eternal silence in the face of hate? James felt a heaviness growing inside him. He wanted to just live, to be himself. But now his life had become an eternal reminder of that day. People didn't look at him as a person, but as an ideal he hadn't chosen for himself. Meanwhile, the motorcyclist, whose name was now known to millions, sat in solitary confinement. His face became a meme, his words an example of how not to behave. Social media was filled with anger. He was condemned, he was laughed at, his family was harassed. "You embarrassed us," his brother called him, barely containing his rage. "You just broke everything, you know? You made us a laughingstock." The motorcyclist tried to justify himself, but his words sounded hollow. He realized that what he had done was not just a moment of anger. It was something more, something he had carried around for years. Hatred, contempt, fear of those who were different from him. And now he was paying for it, feeling every day the contempt he'd once tried to direct at another. At the trial, his face was haggard, his eyes downcast. "I made a mistake," he muttered as his lawyer tried to save his reputation. But the people in the courtroom looked at him with cold hatred. They didn't want to hear an apology. They wanted to see justice served. Meanwhile, James was haunted not only by camera flashes and reporters, but also by his own thoughts. In the silence of his home, he sat on his bed, looking at his hands. They no longer seemed strong to him. "I made it through," he told himself, but his voice sounded unsure. "I did the right thing." But done right didn't mean he felt good. The humiliation, the rage, the pain still lived inside him, reminding him of how close he was to breaking. The next day in the square, James stood at his post again. People surrounded him, some with admiration, some with pity. Some even tried to hand him flowers. He heard whispers. "That's him, the one." But he continued to stand as he always did, a Royal Guardsman. The motorcyclist, meanwhile, sat in a cell where he was being bullied by other inmates. "You think you're the best, don't you?" shouted one of them, hurling a piece of bread in his direction. "And now you're nothing, just nobody." Those words were the final blow to the motorcyclist. He could no longer recognize who he was before that day. His life was now ruined. His name had become a symbol of shame. But James, despite the injury, found the strength to go forward. He knew he couldn't escape what had happened, but he could control how to live with it. His silence became not just a weapon, but a reminder. The power is in not letting evil change you. And every time he walked past the cameras and whispers, he told himself, "I am more than what happened to me. I am a person, not a symbol." The square was filled with people again, as if the incident had never happened. The stones underfoot, touched with morning dew, glistened in the sunlight. However, something had changed. It was in the air, in the hum of the crowd, in the way people looked at the King's Guard. James stood at his post again, but now his presence was more than just part of protocol. The crowd knew his story, but did they know his own? In the back of his mind, he wondered about that. Every day since the incident, he felt like he was not just a guard, but a symbol of fighting an injustice he had never chosen. People came up, filming, asking questions, but in their eyes he saw more curiosity than sympathy. "You're a hero," they said. But to James, that word was like a heavy burden he couldn't shed. The crowd around them began to gather again. A young man with a camera ran up to James and asked quietly, "Can I have a few words? People need to know how you feel. Your silence speaks volumes, but I'm sure you have something to say. Would you like to share?" James turned his head a millimeter, meeting the journalist's gaze. His eyes, cold and impassive, made the young man freeze. "No," James said calmly. The word sounded like the final blow of a hammer on red-hot metal. The journalist backed away, embarrassed. James knew that any word he said would be taken out of context, turned into a weapon, for defense or offense, but not for the truth. Across town, a motorcyclist, recently released on bail, stood at the window of his apartment. The street below was bustling with life, but to him it seemed deserted. His face, gaunt and tired, reflected in the glass. He remembered every moment of the incident, every word he had said, and realized that he could not erase it from his life. His name was now linked to shame, to hatred. He wanted to fix something, but he knew it was no longer possible. His phone rang. It was another unfamiliar number. Ever since his story had gone around the world, his phone had been ringing off the hook. Journalists, activists, people wanting to express their contempt for him. He never answered. But this time, something made him pick up the phone. "Listen." The voice was female, cold and hard. "I don't know why you did it, but I do know one thing. You ruined everything. You've ruined yourself. And now you have a choice. Either you stay the way the world sees you, or you try to change things. Not for your own sake, for others." He hung up without saying a word, but her words echoed in his head. He knew he couldn't get his life back, but was there anything he could do to make amends? He walked out of the apartment, feeling the weight of his actions pulling him down with every step. In the square, James was still standing. People passing by threw glances at him. Whispers accompanied him like shadows. But something had changed. A group of teenagers stopped and looked at him with genuine respect. One of them, gathering his wits, walked over and said, "I saw the video. You're the real deal. Thanks for showing me how to be strong." James didn't answer, but something inside him shifted. Perhaps none of this had been in vain. Perhaps his silence wasn't just a symbol, but a lesson to those who watched. People don't always realize how important it is to simply remain human. By remaining still in the moment when the world demands you break, you're not just protecting yourself. You're giving others hope. James returned home that evening, still feeling the weight of the day. He opened the news. On the screen was the face of a motorcyclist. He was being interviewed, his voice shaky but sincere. "I was wrong. I made a terrible mistake. I can't apologize for what I did because it won't fix anything. But I want to say one thing. Hate accomplishes nothing. It destroys everyone, both those who experience it and those who are victimized by it." James stared at the screen, and for the first time in days, something resembling a smile appeared on his face. It wasn't a complete victory. Nothing could be completely fixed. But it was a first step. Perhaps this man was beginning to realize what it meant to be strong. The square emptied out. People had gone home, but there was something in the air, a strength of spirit. It was a lesson for everyone. In a world full of hatred, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is to just be yourself. Write in the comments what you think about this story. What emotions did it evoke in you? Perhaps in your life you too have experienced racism, injustice, or situations when you had to face hatred and humiliation. How did you cope? What lessons have you learned? It is very important for us to know your point of view, because such topics always provoke complex feelings and deep reflections. We sincerely appreciate each and every one of you who watch our stories, share your thoughts, and support our project. Your support is what helps us raise important issues and tell stories that really make you think. If you want to see more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. It's not just an endorsement. It's a way to show that these topics are meaningful and important to you. We wish you a good day, peace in your soul, and strength to face any challenges of life. Thank you for being with us.